The desert was burning under a sun that seemed to hang low and cruel, painting the canyons in layers of red and gold. Wind swept through the cliffs like a whisper from the ancestors, carrying dust, grit, and the smell of iron. Somewhere in the depths of that canyon, a young Apache woman ran for her life. Her name was Nayeli, and her feet were raw from days of running. Her tribe had scattered after a brutal raid by white soldiers who claimed to bring peace, but left nothing but fire. She had seen her village burn, her people fall, and her brother taken. She had nothing left but a knife, a tattered blanket, and the beating heart that refused to give up. As twilight bled into the canyon walls, Nayeli heard the distant sound of hooves. Soldiers again, she was sure of it. She pressed herself against the rock, breath shallow, eyes wild. The dust plume on the horizon grew closer, and her mind raced. She couldn't outrun horses, not anymore. Then, far across the valley, she saw a small cabin tucked between the hills, a lone figure of shelter in a desert of death. Smoke curled from its chimney, thin and silver. It could belong to anyone. A trap, a savior, or something worse. But she had no choice. She ran. By the time Nayeli reached the cabin, night had fallen like a heavy curtain. The horses were still far but closing in. She circled the building, searching for any sign of who lived there. The corral was empty except for one tired old bay horse, and the fence was patched with raw timber. There was no sign of soldiers, just quiet and the faint glow of lamplight inside. Through a crack in the wooden wall, she saw him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a worn white shirt and leather vest. His hat lay on the table beside a half-finished bottle of whiskey. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone used to being alone. His revolver hung on a nail near the door. Nayeli hesitated. He was a cowboy, one of them. But he didn't wear a uniform. He looked different. His eyes, when he turned toward the window, were not cold like a soldier's. They were tired, haunted. The thunder of hooves echoed closer. She didn't have time to think. She slipped around the back, eased the door open just enough to slide inside, and looked for a place to hide. The cabin was small, just one room. A bed, a stove, a table, a few shelves. But in the corner stood a tall wooden wardrobe, its door slightly ajar. Without a sound, Nayeli darted across the room and pressed herself inside, pulling the door shut just as the cowboy turned from the table. The wardrobe was dark and smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and sweat. Nayeli's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The cowboy moved about the room, muttering softly to himself. Then, the sound she feared most, the knock at the door. A harsh, demanding voice outside barked orders. "Soldiers, Evenin, Marshal," the cowboy's voice drawled, calm but wary. "What brings you out this far?" Nayeli couldn't see, but she could hear the weight in his tone. The men outside pushed in, boots scraping against the floorboards. "Looking for an Apache girl," the marshal said. "Slipped through our lines this morning. She's dangerous." Nayeli held her breath. The cowboy's pause was brief, practiced. "Ain't seen no one but jackrabbits all week." The marshal didn't sound convinced. "Mind if we take a look around?" The cowboy's voice was cold now. "If you think I'd hide one of your fugitives, you don't know me." A tense silence. Then, the marshal laughed dryly. "You're a strange one, Mason. Always keepin' to yourself. Guess we'll be on our way." The boots retreated. The door slammed. Silence again. Nayeli waited a long time before daring to breathe. She could hear the cowboy pacing, muttering something under his breath. Then came the creak of floorboards, closer and closer still. The wardrobe door rattled slightly. Nayeli's fingers tightened around the knife at her side. But the door didn't open. Instead, she heard him sigh. The sound was wary, not suspicious. A man alone with his ghosts. He unbuttoned his vest, tossed it aside. The rustle of fabric followed. His shirt, his belt, the scrape of boots. Through a sliver of light between the boards, she saw his bare shoulders in the lamplight, the long scar that ran across his back, and the way he stared into nothing, as though lost in another life. Nayeli stayed silent, heart pounding. She didn't mean to watch him. But something about the loneliness in his movements drew her eyes. This was no cruel soldier. This was a man broken by the same kind of world that had broken her. He dressed in a clean shirt, doused the lamp, and lay down on the bed. The room fell into stillness, broken only by the slow rhythm of his breathing. Hours passed. Nayeli dared not move. She waited through the night, listening to the desert wind creep through the cracks. Her muscles ached, her throat was dry, and her fear was a living thing inside her chest. But she was alive, for now, and in that dark wooden space, surrounded by his scent and the echo of his quiet life, something unfamiliar stirred in her. Something that wasn't fear. Morning would bring choices she could not yet imagine. For now, the Apache woman in the cowboy's wardrobe closed her eyes and dreamed of fire and freedom. The first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls, dust motes swirling like ghosts in the golden light. The cowboy stirred in his bed, groaning softly as he rolled onto his side. His name, Nayeli would soon learn, was Cole Mason, a name that once echoed through saloons and wanted posters, but now belonged to a man who'd nothing wanted than to be forgotten. Inside the wardrobe, Nayeli's body was stiff, cramped from a night of motionless hiding. Every muscle screamed for relief, yet she did not dare move. Her knife lay across her thigh, a silent reminder of the danger that lingered beyond those four wooden walls. The soldiers would still be searching, and one mistake could mean her death. When the floorboards creaked again, she peeked through the narrow gap. Mason was awake, standing shirtless in the dim light. He poured water from a tin jug into a bowl and splashed his face. His reflection stared back at him in a cracked mirror. Hard eyes, strong jaw. The faint stubble of a man who had long given up on shaving daily. The scar on his shoulder caught the light, twisting like a brand of memory he could never erase. Nayeli's stomach tightened as she watched him move. There was power in his body, but wariness too. A man carrying invisible weight. He dressed slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world, and no one left to see him hurry. When he finally pulled on his boots and hat, the man who had once been vulnerable in lamplight became someone else entirely. A shadow of the Old West, quiet and dangerous. He left the cabin soon after, the door closing with a dull thud. Nayeli waited until the sound of his boots faded, then pushed the wardrobe door open just enough to breathe in fresh air. The scent of coffee and tobacco lingered. She slipped out silently, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The room told her much about its owner. The shelves held no family photos, no keepsakes, only a rifle, a Bible, a tin of tobacco, and a folded letter sealed with wax. A single feather lay on the windowsill, weathered and sun-bleached. It looked almost like one from her own people's headdress. She scanned the room for food and found a loaf of bread, a few pieces of dried meat, and a small pot of beans cooling on the stove. Hunger gnawed at her, and after a hesitant pause, she tore off a piece of bread and ate. It was rough and stale, but it kept her standing. Her eyes flicked toward the window. Outside, Mason was tending to the horse in the corral, his movements steady and patient. He brushed the animal's coat, checked the hooves, and spoke softly to it. There was a gentleness in him that confused her, an unexpected mercy in a world she had come to hate. But she could not stay. Sooner or later, he would discover her, and if he turned her in, the soldiers would not hesitate to hang her. Yet, as she turned toward the door, the sound of distant shouting froze her in place. Through the crack in the window, she saw them again. 3 riders, dust rising behind them, rifles glinting in the sun. The soldiers had returned. Her heart hammered in her chest. Mason looked up, squinting against the glare. He muttered something under his breath, then strode back toward the cabin. Nayeli panicked. She darted back into the wardrobe just as his boots hit the porch steps. The door opened. He stepped inside, hanging his hat and gun on the hook. Through the thin slats, she watched him move to the window, studying the riders who had stopped at the edge of the ridge. He didn't look afraid, just tired of trouble. They called out to him, demanding to know if he'd seen anything unusual. He raised a hand in lazy greeting, pretending to be uninterested. The men lingered for a while, then rode off in another direction. When they were gone, he closed the shutters, poured himself a drink, and sank into the chair by the table. He didn't know that an Apache woman was hidden only a few feet away, her heartbeat echoing through the silence. Time passed. Mason worked on cleaning his revolver, the steady rhythm of metal and cloth breaking the stillness. Then, without warning, he stood and crossed the room, straight toward the wardrobe. Nayeli froze. The handle turned slightly, the wood creaked, and the door opened halfway. Mason reached in, grabbed a clean shirt from the shelf, and shut it again without looking inside. The breath Nayeli had been holding escaped her in a slow, trembling exhale. He changed out of his dusty clothes, standing close enough that she could hear the leather of his belt and the rasp of fabric against his skin. Through a thin crack, she saw his reflection in the mirror, broad back, calloused hands, the weary grace of a man used to hardship. He wasn't handsome in the way young men were, but something about him drew her eyes again and again. He poured himself another drink and stared at the letter on the table. His fingers hovered over it before pulling back. Whatever message it carried, it was one he didn't have the strength to read. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the cry of a distant hawk. Mason stood, holstered his gun, and left again to chop wood behind the cabin. The rhythmic sound of the axe striking echoed through the air. Nayeli used the moment to slip from the wardrobe once more. This time, she didn't steal food. She went to the window and watched him work. The muscles in his arms tensed with every swing. He looked like a man fighting something unseen. The wood splintered, pieces falling in neat piles at his feet. When he paused to wipe his brow, the feather on the windowsill caught her attention again. It wasn't a patch, it was eagle, and beneath it, carved into the wood, were faint letters RM2 initials. Not his. Something about that discovery made her hesitate. Who was the feather for? A woman? A lost friend? The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her back to reality. She darted toward the wardrobe again, heart racing, slipping inside just before Mason returned. He placed the chopped wood near the stove and took another long drink. His gaze lingered on the wardrobe this time, as though sensing something unseen. Then he shook his head, muttered to himself, and sank back into his chair. The sun was setting, bathing the room in a reddish glow. Nayeli sat in the darkness, silent and still. For the second night in a row, she would watch him from the shadows, trapped between fear and something she didn't yet understand. Outside, coyotes began to howl, and in that lonely cabin, two strangers shared the same air with knowing that their fates were already entwined. And as Mason lay down to rest, the Apache woman in his wardrobe stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the man who had unknowingly become her protector. The next morning would change everything. Morning came quietly to the high desert, brushing the land with shades of gold and rose. A thin mist hovered over the fields near the cabin, and the scent of mesquite smoke clung to the cold air. The wind carried the call of distant coyotes fading to the day, leaving behind only silence and the whisper of leaves. Inside the cabin, Cole Mason stirred before dawn, just as he always did. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his face with calloused hands, his movements slow, deliberate. Another day alone. Another day that felt like penance for something long past. The Apache woman, Nayeli, remained hidden in the wardrobe. She had not slept. Her mind was a storm of fear and curiosity. Every sound he made had echoed through her like a heartbeat. She could hear the scrape of his boots against the floorboards, the creak of leather as he pulled on his gun belt, the faint clatter of tin as he prepared his morning coffee. When he stepped outside to fetch water, She finally pushed the wardrobe door open, her limbs stiff and trembling. 2 days without proper rest had left her dizzy. She stood carefully, stretching her aching body, and listened to the steady rhythm of his movements outside. The cabin was filled with the pale light of dawn, soft and golden. Dust floated lazily in the beams that slipped through the cracks in the walls. It was a small, quiet world, his world, and for the first time, she felt something that wasn't fear, safety. She knew she could not stay. But where would she go? The soldiers would still be looking for her, and beyond the hills lay nothing but open desert, miles of thirst, heat, and death. Her eyes wandered again to the letter on the table. It remained unopened, the wax seal cracked but never removed. Something about it haunted her. She wondered who had written to him. A wife, a lost friend. Perhaps it was from the law, or from someone he once betrayed. Every man who lived alone out here carried ghosts, and Mason was no exception. Outside, the sound of the well rope creaked, then fell silent. Her heart jumped. He was coming back. She scrambled toward the wardrobe, but in her haste, her foot caught the corner of the chair. It toppled with a dull thud. The door opened before she could hide. Mason froze in the doorway, the bucket of water sloshing in his grip. His eyes darted to the fallen chair, then to the half-open wardrobe. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the wind, slick through the cracks in the walls. Nayeli stood frozen beside the bed, breath shallow, her dark hair wild around her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. He took in the sight. The torn skirt, the dirt-streaked skin, the fear in her eyes. And realization settled across his expression like dust on still air. She expected him to reach for his gun. But he didn't. He simply set the bucket down. Slowly. Deliberately. His jaw tightened, and his eyes softened, as though he were staring at a memory rather than a stranger. Nayeli's knife trembled in her grip. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. She took one step back, ready to flee, but her body betrayed her exhaustion. The days of running, the nights without rest. It all came crashing down. Her vision blurred, and her knees gave way. The world spun and went black. When she woke, she was lying on the bed. The light outside had shifted, morning was already giving way to noon. Her knife was gone, but so was her fear. A blanket covered her up to the shoulders, and a bowl of water sat beside her on the small table. The man was nowhere in sight. She listened. No sound of boots, no voice. Only the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. She touched her head. It throbbed faintly, but the dizziness had eased. Then she saw him outside through the open window. Mason sat on the porch, hat pulled low over his brow, cleaning his rifle. He looked calm, as though he were waiting for something. Or perhaps someone. Nayeli watched him from inside, her heart twisting with confusion. Why hadn't he turned her in? Why hadn't he tied her up or forced her to leave? Every instinct told her that him didn't show mercy to people like her. Yet here she was, alive, fed, and covered in a blanket that smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. By afternoon, he came back inside. His steps were slow, deliberate. He set a piece of bread and a tin cup of water on the table without looking at her. She watched him carefully, waiting for anger or suspicion, but there was none. Only silence. He went about his work, mending a saddle strap, checking bullets, sweeping the floor. She could sense that he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. She didn't know if it was pity or loneliness that stayed his hand. The sun dipped lower, and long shadows stretched across the cabin. Mason finally sat at the table and took a deep breath. The stillness between them thickened. For the first time, Nayeli looked to him not as an enemy, but as a man. His eyes carried the kind of sorrow that only comes from losing everything. In that grief, she recognized something familiar. The world had taken from both of them. She finished the bread slowly, every bite feeling heavier than the last. When she set the cup down, he rose, walked to the door, and stepped outside again. The night came quickly over the plains, cloaking everything in deep blue. Nayeli stood by the window, watching him as he sat by the small fire outside, staring at the stars. He didn't look toward her once. Yet something in his stillness called to her. A quiet strength, a broken kind of peace. When the wind grew colder, she retreated into the warmth of the cabin. The fire in the stove still burned faintly. The wardrobe stood open now, its emptiness almost symbolic, as if the hiding was over but the story had only just begun. She lay down again, wrapped in his blanket, her body finally surrendering to rest. For the first time in days, she felt safe enough to sleep. Outside, Mason watched the desert horizon, his thoughts far away. He had buried enough ghosts to know that the one in his house would not be easily sent away. And somewhere deep inside him, a spark flickered, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. When morning came, things between them would not be the same. The discovery had changed everything. The morning after the discovery arrived with a heavy sky. Low clouds rolled over the desert plains, swallowing the rising sun in a veil of gray. The air smelled of rain, rare and almost sacred in these parts. The wind hissed through the canyons, stirring the dust and carrying the cry of distant thunder. Inside the cabin, the quiet stretched thin. Cole Mason sat at the edge of the table, running a whetstone along the blade of his knife, each stroke slow and precise. The Apache woman, Nayeli, moved about the small room with caution, unsure of her place now that her secret was known. She no longer hid in the wardrobe. The door stood wide open, a silent witness to the strange peace between them. Mason had given her no sign of anger, no threats, no words at all. He simply let her exist, eating when he ate, drinking when he drank, moving when he moved. Yet beneath that silence lay a tension as fragile as glass. Both were waiting for something to break it. The storm outside seemed to mirror that tension. By midday, the sky had turned dark as iron. The first drops began to fall, slow, fat, and cold. They hit the roof with soft taps that grew louder faster, until the rain came down in sheets. Mason rose, stepping outside to secure the shutters and cover the firewood. Nayeli watched him through the window, the rain soaking his hat and shirt, his movements unhurried and steady. There was a kind of calm in him that the storm couldn't touch. She wondered if he had always been this way, or if solitude had carved it into him. When he came back in, dripping wet, the cabin seemed smaller somehow. The air between them thickened with the scent of rain and wood smoke. He tossed his hat onto the hook and peeled off his soaked shirt, leaving it to dry by the stove. Nayeli turned her face away, but her heart beat faster. She had watched this man from the shadows for days, unseen and unnoticed, studying the way he moved, the way he carried his pain. Now, seeing him so close, the reality of him felt heavier. He was flesh and blood, scarred, strong, human. He dressed in a clean shirt and tended to the fire, his silence unbroken. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the chill of the storm. Outside, the world blurred into gray and thunder. Hours passed. Mason worked on mending his saddle, and Nayeli sat quietly by the stove, the blanket still draped around her shoulders. The rhythmic beat of rain became the only sound between them. Eventually, she rose and began to help him without being asked. She gathered wood, swept the floor, cleaned the dishes. Her hands moved with quiet skill, grace born from survival. Mason watched her for a long moment, but said nothing. He simply allowed her presence to fill the space that had once belonged only to his ghosts. The storm raged through the night, and the cabin became their small world. Two souls bound by circumstance, surrounded by the roar of wind and water. At one point, lightning struck close enough to shake the walls, sending a bright flash through the room. Mason reached instinctively for his rifle, then relaxed again. The sound of the storm seemed to pull old memories from the corners of his mind. Memories of fire, loss, and the sound of thunder that once came from gunfire instead of clouds. He had known war. She could see it in his eyes. As the night deepened, Nayeli sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The rain had begun to ease, but the air still trembled with the last rumbles of thunder. Mason poured a small measure of whiskey and sat opposite her, the lamplight flickering between them. It struck her then how strange fate was. To find herself in the home of a man she should have feared, sharing his silence as though they had always been meant to meet. Outside, the land began to breathe again. The rain softened, the earth drank deeply, and the scent of wet sage drifted through the cracks in the walls. When the last of the storm passed, Mason stood and opened the door. The air outside was cool and fresh, the kind that followed cleansing rain. He stepped out for a moment, letting the wind touch his face, and Nayeli followed him to the threshold. The moon broke through the clouds, silver and soft, casting its light across the glistening land. The canyon below shimmered with puddles that caught the moonlight like scattered glass. The night was quiet, except for the gentle dripping from the roof. In that stillness, something inside both of them shifted. The fear that had once kept her hidden began to fade, replaced by something deeper, an understanding that went beyond words. Mason had seen her for what she was, not an enemy, not a fugitive, but a human being fighting to survive. He turned and met her gaze only briefly, but that single glance held more than speech ever could. She looked away, her chest tightening with emotions she didn't yet have a name for. For so long, she had lived as a shadow, fleeing, hiding, surviving. Now under this roof, she felt something dangerously close to belonging. The fire inside the cabin burned low, its light flickering softly across the wooden floor. Nayeli went back inside, curling up by the hearth. Her exhaustion caught up with her, and her eyes began to close. Mason lingered outside a moment longer, staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there, soldiers still searched, and danger still waited. But for tonight, peace had found them both. When he finally came inside, she was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He set his rifle by the wall, sat at the table, and poured himself one last drink. The storm had left the world cleaner, quieter. He glanced toward her sleeping form, and saw how the firelight painted her face in warm tones. Something about the sight stirred a feeling he hadn't known in years. A longing for something more than survival. He looked away quickly, finishing his drink. The fire crackled softly, and the wind outside carried away the last of the storm. The night settled deep and still, wrapping the cabin in its silence once more. But in that silence, both of them knew the calm couldn't last. Beyond those hills, the world was still cruel, and the past had a way of finding those who tried to hide from it. When dawn came, the rain would be gone, and with it, their fragile peace would begin to crumble. The desert dawn broke with a deceptive calm. After the storm, the world seemed reborn, washed clean, silent, and glimmering beneath the rising sun. Dew clung to the edges of the dry grass, and the air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and juniper. But for all its beauty, the quiet held a warning, the kind that came before trouble. Cole Mason felt it the moment he stepped outside. Years of surviving the borderlands had taught him to listen to that stillness. The way the wind fell mute, the way birds stopped their song. Trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. Inside the cabin, Nayeli was awake, kneeling beside the small stove, coaxing a fire back to life. She had begun to move with ease in his home now, as though some invisible boundary had been crossed. The fear in her eyes had softened into watchfulness, her silence no longer defensive, but thoughtful. For several days since the storm, their uneasy companionship had settled into something wordless and steady. She worked beside him, cooked meals, fetched water. He taught her little gestures of safety. How to tell when riders approached by the sound of their gait. How to tell north by the wind. He never questioned why she stayed. She never explained why she couldn't leave. But that morning, as the air grew heavy and still, both of them sensed the shift. Far off, beyond the ridge, the faint echo of hooves carried through the air. It was a slow rhythm at first, steady, controlled. Not the hurried pace of travelers, but the deliberate stride of men hunting. Mason's eyes narrowed. He went to the corner and checked his rifle, his movements calm but sure. The moment the sound reached Nayeli's ears, her body stiffened. The color drained from her face, and memories she had tried to bury came roaring back. The soldiers, the burning, the endless running. Mason didn't have to say anything. She knew. The riders were coming for her. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. 4 figures were visible now against the bright sand, their shapes cutting dark lines across the rising sun. They were too distant to identify, but he could feel the hostility in their formation. He had seen that kind of pursuit before. Calculated, cold. He went back inside, closing the door behind him. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. Nayeli's eyes followed him, her breath quick and shallow. He moved like a man preparing for a reckoning. For the first time since she had appeared in his life, Mason felt something deeper than duty stirring in him. He had once promised himself never to fight again, never to take another side, never to kill for anyone. But now, seeing her standing there, frightened, defiant, caught between a world that wanted her dead and a past that had already tried, he knew he couldn't keep that promise. Outside, the riders drew closer. Dust began to rise behind them. The sound of their horses was louder now, clear and deliberate. They were not passing through. They were coming straight for the cabin. Mason moved quickly, setting the rifle on the table, checking his revolver. His face was calm, but there was something cold in his eyes. A quiet, dangerous resolve that belonged to a man who had already seen too much of death. Nayeli stood by the window, her hand pressed to the glass, watching them approach. The wind caught her dark hair, lifting it like a banner of defiance. In that moment, she looked less like a fugitive, and more like a warrior reborn from ash. The riders stopped a few hundred yards from the cabin. Mason could see them clearly now. 3 soldiers in dust-covered uniforms and a man in a brown coat that marked him as a scout. His kind knew every trail, every canyon. He was the type who could track a ghost through a sandstorm. They spoke among themselves, their gestures sharp. Then one of them dismounted and began walking toward the cabin. Mason stood motionless. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came before violence. Inside, Nayeli gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had seen these men before. Men who burned villages and called it justice. They were the same ones who had killed her kin and chased her into this desolate corner of the world. The soldier at the front paused outside the door. The others waited near their horses, hands near their rifles. Mason didn't open the door. He didn't move. For a long time, there was only the wind. Then came the sound of footsteps retreating. The man turned back to his horse. They mounted up and began to circle slowly around the cabin, searching for tracks. Nayeli's heart pounded in her chest. She knew they would find signs of her soon. Footprints near the stream, ashes from the extra food she'd cooked. There would be no hiding once they discovered she was there. Mason went to the window and watched their slow patrol. His eyes hardened. He could have given her up, and it would all be over. The law would ride away, and his life would return to its quiet, empty routine. But something deep within him refused to let that happen. He had spent years trying to forget the man he used to be. A soldier, a gunslinger, a survivor of too many wrong choices. But now, standing in that doorway with his rifle ready, he understood that redemption sometimes came wearing unexpected faces. Hers, for instance. The soldiers dismounted again, splitting apart, checking the ground. Mason's jaw clenched. He moved to the back of the cabin, quietly loading ammunition. Nayeli watched him, her fear shifting into fierce and wordless. The sound of boots drew nearer. One of the men was coming toward the back door. Mason positioned himself by the window, his rifle steady, eyes sharp. The air between them felt alive, charged like the seconds before lightning. And then, silence. The soldier stepped out of sight. Mason exhaled slowly. But the quiet didn't last. A horse neighed suddenly outside, followed by a shout. They had found something. Perhaps her footprints near the stream. The shouting grew louder. Mason turned to Naomi. There was no need for words. She nodded, understanding. Her hand brushed the knife hidden beneath her blanket. The horse's hooves thundered as the men closed in. The first rifle shot cracked through the air, splintering the edge of the cabin door. Mason ducked low, returning fire. The report of his rifle echoed across the canyon, scattering crows from the rocks. Naomi crouched by the stove, heart racing, as bullets tore through the walls. The small cabin shook with the violence of it, dust and splinters falling from the beams. Mason reloaded quickly, firing again. One of the riders fell, his horse bolting into the brush. But there were still three, the air filled with smoke and gunpowder. The sound of horses screamed through the chaos. Naomi pressed herself against the wall, the world spinning in noise and light. Mason fought with grim precision, each shot deliberate, controlled. At last, the gunfire faded. Silence returned, broken only by the groans of the dying and the distant echo of wind. When Naomi finally lifted her head, Mason was standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. The soldiers were gone, 2 fled, 1 dead. The scout lay motionless near the rocks. The battle was over. But the peace that followed was heavier than before. He turned back toward her, the firelight catching the edge of his face. She met his gaze, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them, a recognition that their fates were now bound together in blood and consequence. The law would return. They both knew it, and when it did, running would be the only choice left. The smoke from the battle drifted over the canyon like a ghost. The morning sun rose red, filtering through dust and the scent of gunpowder. Cole Mason stood outside the cabin, rifle in hand, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The lawmen were gone for now, but the silence left behind was uneasy. He knew too well that silence never lasted long in the frontier. Behind him, Naomi moved slowly through the small cabin, gathering what little could be carried. Water, dry bread, Mason's spare coat. Her hands trembled slightly, though her face was calm. The memory of the fight clung to her. Every gunshot still echoed somewhere deep inside. She had survived worse, yet this time survival felt different. She was no longer running for herself alone. The cabin that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a trap. The men Mason had driven off would return, and they would not come alone. Word would spread fast. An Apache woman hiding in a cowboy's cabin, soldiers dead in her defense. The West had never forgiven such things. Mason stepped back inside, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. The place was marked by the fight. Holes in the walls, shattered glass, blood darkening the dirt near the door. He took one last look at the home he had built, the place where he had tried to live quietly, away from the noise of the past. That dream was gone now. He packed his saddlebag with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before. Every motion carried the weight of finality. Naomi watched him silently. For days, she had hidden in his wardrobe, watching him live his ordinary life, studying the way he moved, the small kindness in his solitude. Now, watching him prepare to abandon everything, she felt the pull of something she couldn't name, something both painful and precious. They rode out before noon. The desert stretched wide and endless before them, a sea of rust, colored rock and golden grass swaying in the wind. Mason led the way, his figure steady in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Naomi followed behind on a smaller horse he had saddled for her, the rhythm of its hooves steady against the earth. For a while, neither of them looked back. The land around them shimmered with heat, broken only by the cry of hawks circling overhead. They rode for hours, crossing dry riverbeds and narrow ravines, until the cabin was nothing but a memory behind them. Mason knew these lands well. He had ridden them once as a scout, long before he had turned his back on war. Now he used that knowledge to lead her deeper into country no lawman dared to enter. By nightfall, they reached a hidden canyon. The walls rose steep and high, casting long shadows in the dying light. A small stream ran at its base, wending between boulders like a silver ribbon. They stopped there, the horses drinking deeply from the water. Mason built a small fire, just enough to keep the night chill away. The stars began to bloom above them, one by one, until the sky was thick with light. The world felt far away, like a bad dream fading with distance. Naomi sat across from him, wrapped in his coat, her eyes reflecting the firelight. In that quiet moment, surrounded by nothing but the hum of the night and the whisper of the stream, she looked less like a fugitive and more like something eternal, like the land itself had shaped her from its dust and flame. She thought back to the day she had hidden in his wardrobe, frightened and desperate. She had watched him change clothes every morning, his movements slow and unguarded, as though he trusted the empty room around him. She had learned his rhythms, his habits, the small humanity of him. It was strange how safety could be born from something as simple as watching another person live. Now, after everything, she realized she had come to know him not just through his actions, but through the silence that lingered between them. In that silence, there was understanding, a kind that didn't need words. Mason looked out across the dark canyon. He knew there would be no peace for them in this land. The soldiers would come again, and when they did, they would bring more men, more guns, more reasons to kill. But for now, for this single night, they were free. He sat watching the fire burn low, the shadows flickering against the canyon walls. He thought of how strange fate could be. A man hiding from the world, a woman hiding from death, both finding something worth fighting for in the space between. The night grew colder. The wind moved through the canyon like a voice from the past. Naomi lay near the fire, her eyes half closed, the warmth painting soft color into her face. She had been running for so long that stillness felt like a new kind of danger. Yet beside him, even the fear felt bearable. When dawn came, the fire had burned to embers. The horizon glowed pale gold, promising another day of flight. Mason saddled the horses again, his movements deliberate and quiet. Naomi watched him, her thoughts heavy with unspoken truth. She knew that the road ahead would not end easily. The west was vast, but the eyes of men reached far. Still, she had chosen this path. For the first time since her world had burned, she had chosen something for herself. Not survival, not revenge, but trust. They rode again as the sun climbed. The wind swept over the canyon rim, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage. Behind them, the world they had known disappeared into light. Ahead, the mountains stood silent and ancient, waiting. Mason guided his horse through the narrow pass, glancing back once at the woman who followed him. In that moment, he understood that whatever lay ahead, danger, exile, or death, it would not matter. The quiet between them had already said what needed saying. By midday, they reached a plateau overlooking the open desert. From there, the world stretched endless and wild, untouched by the law or the lies of men. Mason stopped, taking in the view. Naomi rode up beside him, her hair whipping in the wind. They sat there for a long time, the silence between them full of things that could never be spoken. Two lives once broken, now bound by the strange mercy of fate. Far below, the desert shimmered in the heat, vast and unforgiving. But for the first time, neither of them feared it. Because somewhere between the ashes of their past and the promise of the horizon, they had found something neither had known they were searching for. A place where the hunted could rest, and the lonely could finally be seen. The wind rose, carrying away the last traces of smoke and sorrow. The canyon behind them faded into shadow. Ahead lay the long, untamed road, one that stretched toward freedom, toward the unknown, toward a future written not in words, but in the quiet understanding of two souls who had finally stopped running. And as they rode off into the blazing gold of the setting sun, the land swallowed their tracks, leaving only silence. The story of the Apache woman and the cowboy would drift through the frontier like a legend told around fires, of how an outlaw heart found mercy in the most unexpected place, and how love, in its quietest form, survived the wilderness itself.